Welcome to our 2015 European trip. Italy is made up of many distinct regions, each of which has its own unique characteristics of language, food, and customs. This is because various parts of the country had been ruled by many different invaders until it was finally unified in the late 1800s. So it is more accurate to say we visited Tuscany rather than Italy. Although Florence is the highlight of Tuscany, we had visited it in 1970. This time we elected to go to smaller cities. We based ourselves in Siena for 9 nights, La Spezia to see the 5 villages in the Cinque Terre for 4 nights, and Lucca for a week. After flying into Pisa, we picked up our car and headed to Siena, about a 2-hour drive. The symbol of the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus being fed by a wolf, are also symbols of the legend that Siena was founded by the son of Remus. The heart of the city is the Piazza del Campo, a gently sloping plaza that leads down to the Palazzo Comunale, or City Hall, with the Torre del Mangia. At the upper edge of the piazza is the Fonte Gaia, containing the reproductions of sculptures by the famous Jacopo del Quercia. The restaurants around the edge, though overpriced, are a pleasant spot to survey the world. And popular at night, too. This painting of a 15th century bull hunt in the piazza is one of many interesting activities that took place there. Il Palio, a horse race that started in the Middle Ages, continues to this day, every August. I climbed the 102-meter Torre del Mangia. From where I could look down on the piazza. And over the other highlights of the city. Starting as a military outpost and invaded frequently, Siena is sited on a hill, with many of the walls and gates still intact. Parking in the city is very limited, so after parking outside the walls, there are escalators to take us into the city, a feature we appreciated very much. There are 6 segments in this escalator, about a 3.5-minute ride. It beat climbing stairs. The streets curve around the Piazza del Campo, and I was frequently uncertain of where we were, as we sought out various highlights or restaurants. We found one particularly interesting restaurant in Siena, the Taverna di San Giuseppe, with its barrel vaults. The Church of San Domenico is associated with Santa Caterina, who took her vows there. Of some significance to me, being brought up in a city named after her, St. Catherine's. Nearby is the house in which she was born, the rooms turned into chapels. In the cathedral square, the Duomo Piazza, is the Santa Maria della Scala, a former pilgrims' hospital. Separate wards for men and women can be seen. As well, in what is known as the Pilgrims' Hall, frescoes by Jacopo della Quercia, clearly a famous artist of his time. The frescoes describe the activities of this building as an early European hospital created in 898 AD. In the basement of this building is the old sacristy. Also in the basement, the Archaeological Museum, which is created in the 1920s and 30s from earlier collections, and the treasury containing precious items from the Imperial Chapel of Constantinople in 1359. Down here as well are Roman and Etruscan sculptures. The undisputed highlight of the city is the Duomo or cathedral, one of Italy's great Gothic churches, built around 1200 AD. The interior is as marvelous as the exterior. The most precious feature is the inlaid marble floor, decorated with panels depicting historical and biblical subjects. Another highlight is the marble pulpit by another famous sculptor, Pisano. Through the small door at the bottom left of the screen is the library that houses the books of Silvio Piccolomini, Pope Pius II, of whom we'll hear more later. Attached to the Duomo is the baptistry, a marvelous structure by itself. Our hotel outside the city was convenient to visit a number of other cities and towns in the pleasant, peaceful countryside. We went out to see towns like San Gimignano that are less than an hour away. This town is renowned for the many towers. The height of each tower was a status symbol for the family that owned it. Although the day was gray, it wasn't raining yet, so we were able to get our first taste of these Tuscan towns in Volterra. The main piazza, that was full of noisy children on a school trip, has the Palazzo Pretorio, the town hall on one side, with the Torre del Porcellino, or Piglet Tower. The Palazzo Priori, on the opposite side, is said to have been the model for the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. We toured the palazzo and climbed the tower for a view of the countryside. we left the piazza for a short tour of the small town. Stopping at the first of many gelaterias, this one with an impressive ceiling. On another day, we went to Montalcino. We could see the tower of the fort and headed towards it. From there, we wandered the narrow streets to the Piazza del Popolo, the main piazza. In the base of the tower, a statue to one of the town founders. Located in the countryside near Montalcino is a Sant'Antimo monastery. We had some difficulty finding it, but eventually got there. In typical Tuscan countryside, it is in a pretty location with a very austere interior. It's Sunday in Montepulciano, so the church bells are ringing in the Duomo on the Piazza Grande, the main piazza. Also on this piazza is the town hall, or Palazzo Comunale. Opposite the Duomo is the town well. In the distance from this high point can be seen Lago Trasimeno, the largest lake in the area. We headed further into the town where we could see decorations on many of the fine palazzi and churches. We encountered an interesting plaque in this town, demonstrating the conflicting attitudes in this country during World War II. The town of Pienza is near Montepulciano, in this beautiful area. It is a small town with a famous founder, Silvio Piccolomini, also known as Pope Pius II. His palazzo is on the main piazza beside the Duomo. In the interior courtyard, we see the Piccolomini family crest. The garden behind the palazzo looks out on a beautiful view of the countryside. Our tour through the palazzo was with audio recorders, set for the language of each visitor. The Duomo, beside the Palazzo, has the symbol of Pope Pius II above the main door. We spent our time enjoying a walk through the relatively quiet streets of this pretty town and then headed back to Siena. Assisi, famous because of St. Francis, who was born here in 1182, is not in Tuscany, but only an hour and a half from Siena. Looking out over the valley, the basilica named after him is large, containing 2 churches on different levels. Approaching from the parking lot, we climbed up to the piazza for the lower church. There was a wedding that day for a carabinieri officer. After going up to the upper church, we left from the upper piazza to head into the town center. Along the way, we met these monks. Even they have to shop, I guess. The central piazza is the Piazza Comune, with this fountain, and a temple to Minerva, now a church. After refreshing ourselves with a gelato, we headed back to the car, passing other interesting buildings. It was a 2.5-hour drive from Siena to La Spezia, from where we planned to visit the Cinque Terre villages. We couldn't check into our hotel before 2 o'clock, so we decided to spend some time at a restaurant in the tiny coastal village of Tellaro. Driving on the narrow, twisty roads was quite a change from the autostrada. We eventually found the Osteria La Caletta, and I enjoyed some marvelous fish dishes. Starting with plate after plate of antipasta, or hors d'oeuvres. After checking into our hotel, we went down to the harbor to find out times for the ferries to the Cinque Terre villages. The harbor is quite large, and we strolled the length of the dock to look at the big yachts. We could also see a number of Italian Navy ships nearby. Looking inland, we had a great view of the Apennine Alps that are not very far away. Supper that night was at a wine bar we found. One of the highlights of La Spezia was the Naval Museum in the naval dockyards, with its naval memorial. In World War II, this was the base for the two-man submarines. The captain steered the sub, and the mine layer attached the explosive to the enemy hull. This cutter allowed them to cut through anti-submarine nets. Motor torpedo boats also operated from this base. When close to an enemy target, they were set on course and the crew jumped overboard. This museum also had a cipher section, a collection of ships' figureheads, and models of ships. Later, we went up to the high point of the town, the Castello di San Giorgio. From where we had a panoramic view of La Spezia. The next morning, we caught a ferry to take us to the northernmost Cinque Terre village. The ferry crossed the bay to Porto Venere, which looked attractive, but bus and ferry schedules to it didn't fit our schedule. The advantage of this slow boat to Monte Rosso was that we saw each village from the water. Rio Maggiore, Manarola, Vernazza, several other small coastal villages on the way. And finally arrived at Monte Rosso, the largest of the Cinque Terre villages. It has the only sand beach. But the ferry docked on the other side of the headland, so we explored that part of town first. After seeing as much of the town as we wanted to, we caught the train to Vernazza, the next town to the south. In most of these villages, the first place we headed was the focal point, the harbor. Vernazza had the best spot to grab a table on the piazza overlooking the harbor. Although this restaurant, with its overlook, would have been attractive too. As we wandered up the one main street, we came upon this interesting grotto. From the harbor, we had our first view of the walking trail that connects these villages. We had returned to La Spezia by train from Vernazza, since they are much faster than the ferries. only about 20 minutes compared to a couple of hours by ferry. The next day we took the train to Corniglia, the next town south of Vernazza. Corniglia is the only one of these towns with difficult access to the water, so it was a bit of a climb up the 363 steps. After a coffee and juice in the little piazza, we checked out the town. Since the town was built on these peaks, the soccer players needed a net to avoid losing their ball. After lunch with a balcony view, we took the train to the next town to the south, Manarola. The trail between the villages can be seen from this viewpoint in Manarola. Manarola is a fishing village and the boats are stored on the main street. Moving the boats into the small harbor, either dragging them over these wood strips or using a crane to lower them. When the ferry comes into these towns, the loading and unloading of passengers is challenging. Manarola provides the iconic view of these villages. Our last town to visit was Rio Maggiore. As well as the sunbathers, we even had scuba divers here. This is a beautiful area. The towns are attractive, each with its own character. However, we were unfortunate to have been here on an Italian holiday, and the trains between the towns were a zoo. So we looked forward to our next stop, Lucca. The drive from La Spezia to Lucca was just over an hour, although getting out of La Spezia was as challenging as it had been getting into it. Lucca was only half an hour from Pisa, so it would be very convenient to get our flight home. Since we were in Lucca for a week, we had time to explore the Garfagnana, the foothills of the Apennine Alps. With the weather being unseasonably hot, it was nice to get out of the city. On our way, we came across this unique bridge called the Devil's Bridge. Built in the 11th century and rebuilt in its final configuration, a common style in the Garfagnana region, in the 13th century. Without a specific destination in mind, we continued till we found the village of Castiglione di Garfagnana. We parked our rental jeep outside and explored inside the fortified village, built in the era of the wars of the 13th century. But not much was open, so we went on to find a restaurant for lunch, where we had a great view of the mountains. On another day, we headed to the Abetone Pass in ski country. Since this wasn't ski season, nothing was open. As we went back down the mountain, we passed through some beautiful forests. We had noticed a medieval village called Cutigliano previously, and we headed towards it. Built in the mountains, the streets were narrow, steep, and attractive. The town hall in the main piazza was a highlight. Opposite it, local women were working on a religious art project. Driving out of Cutigliano, we passed the restaurant where we had a pizza for lunch. As we continued down out of the hills, we saw this town of La Lima perched on a hilltop, with a suspension bridge across the river below. The wall surrounding the medieval center of Lucca is the reason this gem has been preserved. The 3-kilometer walk on top of the wall around the city has become an attractive park for walkers, joggers, and bikers, as well as tourists. When lit at night, the wall is even more attractive. Rooftop gardens are a common feature. From the wall, we could see many of the highlights of the town. Getting around the town by bike is popular, with 4- and 6-seaters available for families. The day after we arrived was a national holiday. School was out, and several groups of Italian cubs were being herded around the city. Many of the churches have striking features or contain important art. The Duomo or cathedral, seen from the wall, and from the piazza, presents many beautiful details. Each column of the facade is a different design, created by a different sculptor. The Church of San Frediano has a marvelous 13th century mosaic in Byzantine style. The interior includes columns with these capitals recycled from the Roman amphitheater. But the highlight is this 12th century baptismal font. The Church of San Francesco, also from the 13th century, is now a school with a pleasant cloister. However, the most dazzling church is San Michele. Unlike other piazzas we saw, this one has very few people on it, although there are restaurants and gelaterias around the edge. The unique Anfiteatro Piazza is elliptical because the buildings were erected on the original Roman amphitheater foundation. There are lots of other piazzas, large and small. In this piazza, I went searching for the band I could hear. While Rita was waiting for me at an outdoor cafe. We had lunch a couple of times here beside the Puccini Museum with a statue honoring the hometown boy. Although the streets are supposed to be for pedestrians, it's still necessary to watch for cars, motorcycles, and bikes. The streets are quiet and safe at night. Meals were generally not a highlight on this trip. Surprisingly, the best meal we had was in the Sicilian restaurant, thanks to advice from TripAdvisor. It looked very nondescript from the outside, but the interior, service, and fish meal were excellent. Towers were a status symbol back in the 13th century, so all important families had one. The most striking one that remains is the Torre Guinigi, with shade trees on top, and providing views over the whole town. A magnificent home that was open for tours was the Palazzo Pfana. Originally built in 1660 by the Morricone family, it eventually fell into the hands of Felix Pfana, a German beer brewer whose talents were requested by the Duke of Lucca in the mid-1800s. With an elegant interior. an unexpected treat was coming across a display of Leonardo da Vinci's work with models and some of his drawings, covering war machines like this self-propelled cart using a spring for energy, and used for carrying a giant crossbow, an arched bridge, and a defensive feature built into walls to push scaling ladders away from them. Mechanical equipment such as these early types of ball bearings, a bicycle, a vertical drill, a crane operated by a winch for lifting heavy objects, and rack and pinion gears that Rita operated, flying machines such as this parachute, a glider, and an aerial screw suggestive of a helicopter. Hydraulic equipment like this hydraulically powered saw,
Oh, you want to take a picture?
and a water pump that Rita also could demonstrate. And of course, there were examples of some of his drawings and paintings. The surprise opportunity to review the work of this Tuscan genius was a wonderful way to end our Tuscan visit. We had pleasant memories of this part of Italy from our trip in the 1970s. Tuscany is a popular tourist destination, but had not reached the top of our list of future trips. The impetus for this trip was a detective novel. The description of Lucca in it was so fascinating that I decided that Tuscany would be the locale for our next trip. The highlights included the circular park on top of the walls, the amphitheatro on the foundation of the Roman amphitheater, and the towers, particularly the Torre Guinigi, with the shade trees growing on top of it. The city lived up to my hopes. Although the Cinque Terre are not in Tuscany, they are adjacent to it. Not knowing about it previously, I'd heard about it from my dental hygienist and added it to our itinerary. A major attraction are the hiking trails, but we satisfied ourselves with the pretty towns. Siena was selected as our base for a large part of the trip because it was smaller than Florence, but had several interesting sights itself. It was also central to numerous small towns that looked very interesting in our guidebook. It was an interesting trip. It took us to many spots that were completely new to us. As a result, we have added to our store of pleasant memories.